You are now listening to the EnterVR podcast. I'm Chris Miranda, your host, and today I'm speaking with Dr. Juliano Calil. He's an adjunct professor at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey, California. He's co-founder of the Virtual Planet, a company focused on communicating science in an immersive way. And I'm just so very excited to speak with you today, Dr. Calil or Juliano. And again, thanks so much for being on the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Chris. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Likewise. And so you came across so the other day I realized I haven't I've been it seems to me just talking about and being involved in virtual reality for so long since 2013. I remember being one of those people that dreamed a lot, and I still do, dreamed about a lot about the potential virtual reality and about what are the possibilities of this technology outside of just entertaining people and providing them an escape, which are completely valid, but also educating them and giving them something different, something that mass media, legacy media doesn't do anymore. And I and somewhere along that line, I've sort of got caught up in the technology, the just the intricacies, the details, and forgot the big picture. And it wasn't until very recently that out of nowhere I just realized, why has it taken me so long to speak to someone that's working? And not that I haven't, but it's been a minute. And I love the people I've talked to in the past. But man, I'm so excited to talk to you because you're working on something that is very close, very deep, very much aligned with my own passions, and it's the climate crisis. And you've developed with your team an app, an application, an experience that revolves around, at least the one that I'm familiar with, is it revolves around visualizing the impact of sea level rise across different regions and different communities. It's available on Oculus Go, Quest, and it's on web browsers. And I just want to thank you for the work you're doing. And before we get started going deeper into your work, I just to give the audience an idea of the importance of talking about the climate crisis. Why is this issue important? What is at stake here?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. It's a very important question because the crisis is in many ways it's already here, right? We talk about climate change and we think, oh, what's going to happen by the end of the century and things like that. But we're starting to see some of the impacts happening as we speak, right? Sea levels are rising and the sea level rise rates are increasing rapidly. We have more frequent, intense storms happening, wildfires, droughts are getting more intense and more severe. So while it's really important to reduce our emissions and address and try to reduce, the amount of climate change that we'll experience, we're already locked in to a good amount. So the need to adapt to a new climate is already here. And that's kind of my passion and what we're trying to tap into here is actually, we need to understand some of these issues better. And although the planet's changing at a global scale, we really feel those impacts locally, right, at our communities. So how can we start talking about this to the general public and communicating some of this, quite frankly, like complicated topics in ways that don't scare people away, don't traumatize them, but call attention to the issues. But I think that more importantly, we need to look at solutions and what can we do at our local level, our community level to really adapt, in addition to all the regional, state, federal, and global efforts that need to happen as well, right?
Indeed. And, I don't want to scare people, but I just want to make sure that we face these realities without really sugarcoating things. And I want to know what would happen if we continue going down the current path of releasing 40 to 60 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere per year, at the current rate again. What would that look like, 30, 50 years from now if we just continue down this path?
Yeah, and that's another very important question, and it's we'll be basically looking at a different planet, I think. It might not be 30, 50 years, but, a little further down the road, things will start, they're already looking a little different as we speak, right? But it will be a very different system, like a planet system, because the issue with climate change is that we see some of these trends that are going on, and then, temperatures are rising, ice melt over the planet is increasing, sea levels rising, and some of the things I mentioned before. But there are, some unknown tipping points and some problems that some of the systems might start breaking down. And some of them, there are also these feedback loops that we know some of them really well, but there are some that are kind of unknown. We don't quite understand that. There's a lot of talk about the methane now in the permafrost, and some of the things that when you start freezing the lava, all that methane that's trapped could be released, and no one knows for sure the exact amounts and what kind of this tipping point impacts that could happen at some point. So it's really, really important that we do not continue on this current levels of emissions.
And just to bring this subject back a little bit closer to you and your personal story, why is this important to you? Why does this subject matter to you personally? How did you find yourself working on this subject?
Yeah, and it was kind of interesting, Chris, when you're talking about the introduction about, you I think we both got that bug, right? It's like, this is a crisis. There's something that needs to be done, and what is our role in this, right? How can we help? And I think it's kind of a all hands on deck kind of situation when we need all the help that we can get. And the great thing about this is that no matter what skills you have, you can apply them to the problem, right? So my story, I used to work in tech. I was an IT consultant. I was designing decision support systems for large corporations for a long time. And then around 2010, I had this, that's when I caught the bug. It's like, it was around the same couple of years after I started kite surfing. So being in the ocean, in the waters, and, understanding the winds. And I always liked physics since I was a kid. So I got really interested in understanding Earth systems, right? How does the planet function as a series of processes that are interconnected? And how could one single species be altering things at a planetary scale? So that topic kind of still fascinates me. And then I thought, how can I get engaged? How can I, apply some of the things I knew at the time? And there was a big gap, right? Because I knew a lot about designing decision support systems, but I didn't know enough about the science and the problem. So I kind of quit my job. It was kind of a long process there to make that transition, but I finally created the courage, quit my job, went back to school, and then I got a master's in environmental science and management at the Brand School at UC Santa Barbara. And then after being in school for about almost 2 years, learning about the Earth systems and climate change, I got even more passionate about the ocean. So I decided to continue my education and got a PhD in ocean sciences with a focus on climate change and coastal adaptation. That's when I said, well, how can we, what needs to be done and how can we get there? So I went on and through the PhD, I learned a lot more about some of the connections between this complicated systems and how we're affecting them. But also one of the things that became quite clear was we would have this Friday afternoon lab sessions where the department would invite scientists from all over, and those great scientists, to talk about their work. And I'll be sitting in the back and listening to some of those presentations. And quite frankly, it's like I wasn't really getting a lot of what was being communicated. So I went through this serious case of imposter syndrome. It's like, I'm really not smart enough to be here. But then I started asking my colleagues about that. It's like, and they were like, well, no, it's not just you. I'm not really getting a lot of what's been said here. And granted, that was like those are in-depth and technical talks. But I started noticing, and we know that, communicating science, it's a problem, right? So that became kind of the key thing for me. There are three really things that I'm really passionate about. One is technology from my tech days, and we'll talk a little later. I can tell you a little bit more about the VR part. And we fly drones, we do 3D models, we use all these different technologies to develop this tool. So I'm really passionate about technology. This whole climate change and the Earth systems processes, it's something that really fascinates me. And then the part which was kind of part of my research was how do we bring people into the equation, right? So socioeconomics, until like 5, 6 years, 7 years ago, you didn't have socioeconomics as a component on vulnerability assessments for the coastline, for instance. We would look at models of sea level rise and coastal storms. We would look at property values on the coast or infrastructure, but not, what are the capacity of that community or those pockets of community to really adapt. So that's kind of this multidisciplinary approach to this. I think it's what made me really passionate, and bringing this all together in this new venture like Virtual Planet, and talking to communities and understanding their needs and designing these tools to help them communicate and engage with their communities. That has been like I think the most fulfillment I had in my whole career, and I love it. So
awesome. And why? Just to segue into this, perfect segue into the next question I had for you, which is why use virtual reality and immersive technologies to transmit this message you want to convey? What is VR? What do these technologies do that legacy media cannot? Why not do it over a newspaper? Why not do it over email? Why not do it over podcasts? Why VR specifically?
So there are a couple of reasons, right? And the reason why I got into VR was because I grew up in São Paulo in Brazil, and I my whole life I've been playing video games. So I kind of, that's another passion that I kind of left off, but it's part of the technology passion there. But the thing with VR is, and we were very lucky to partner with the folks at the Virtual Human Interactions Lab at Stanford that are doing a lot of the research on this. And we see this on when we bring the headsets to our community events, the way that people react to those immersive images and being able to interact with them, it kind of triggers something different, right? It's not like looking at a flood map on Google Maps, for instance. It's much deeper than that. And there's some preliminary research showing that even though, we do a lot of events at libraries and community halls, so even though you're putting a headset, you're sitting at the library, that you're there, but when you're transported to this aerial view of your neighborhood and you see it could be a flooding, or it could be what it would look like if we would restore the dunes or something like that. So you see the changes, it impacts your whole body in a different way. So we have this aerial views that you're flying, on the blimp. And if you're a little afraid of heights, your palms will sweat, your heart beats a little faster. So physiologically, you react as if what you're seeing is real. And that's super powerful, right? And then, there's some studies that use MRI in VR versus looking at the real image, and the parts of the brain that light up are very similar as well. So we're tapping into a different cognitive processes here that I think make that decision making a lot more engaged than looking at just a photograph or a map. And one of the things that we've been using in sea level rise and coastal adaptation specifically, you go to a typical community event, there's a big map printed, and parts of it are painted blue to depict some potential future flooding. But it's very hard to relate to those things, right? One of my colleagues once said, well, we're not birds, right? We're not used to looking things top down. We need some perspective. You need to be a little more immersed to really understand some of those things. So there's still, quite a bit of research that's needed on that front, but we're seeing it in our events that when we bring the headsets and people go through it, they get way more engaged. They stay at the event. All our events run late because people just want to talk more and they ask more questions. It's a much different reaction than when you go through a typical kind of sea level rise project. And one of the studies, one of my favorite studies is from the group at Stanford, was they have you in VR and you're cutting down trees, with a virtual chainsaw, and they have this ground platform that kind of shakes when the trees fall down. And they tracked people's use of paper after, going through the experience, and they found there's a significant decrease in consumption. I think it was 20%. Less paper being used by the people that did the experience rather, than compared with other folks that didn't do the experience in VR. So there's something there that we're tapping into that I think is really powerful. And I think it can be applied for good in this way and many others.
Yeah, I just to piggyback on that, I think I also saw something where Stanford was giving people an avatar of Superman or some sort of like really strong character figure, and they would see themselves as Superman, and all of a sudden, or that a strong character from a comic or whatever, and they would all of a sudden they've noticed that a good portion of them would fix their posture, and they noticed that their self-esteem sort of went up. Like there was this measurable impact on their self-esteem. I think that using VR in this way is amazing, and to hear you speak about people staying after hours to engage with your content brings me a lot of hope. That's a great sign. And just to dig deeper into the idea of exploring sea level rises in an immersive way, can you tell me more about that sort of design process? What did it look like? At the beginning, sort of walk me through some of the ideas that you and your team had going forward that made it and didn't make it to the final product.
Yeah, that's honestly still a work in progress, Chris. We're the way it all started was I love flying drones, and I was out in the coast here. I live in Santa Cruz, California, so I went to the beach here, and I was kind of flying the drones over the cliffs, trying to do maybe a 3D model or just for fun. And then I had this insights like, why can't we use this great images, right? You can get like a 4K, really high quality video from a drone for a few $100s these days. It's like, why can't we use tools like this to communicate some of these issues? And so I had that idea, and then I started doing 3D models, and we're using this technique called photogrammetry, where you take hundreds of photos from a bird's eye view, and then the computer kind of through some really smart math and trigonometry creates a 3D cloud of points, and then you can make that into a model. You apply texture, and it looks really cool. And I was thinking of that, and then at the same week, I was like, whoa, what if could we do that and put that in virtual reality so we could immerse people on it and see how that would work. So that was kind of the inspiration for this. At the time, I called a couple of colleagues that are in Brazil, and one of them was teaching video game design at a college. And I called him and said, hey, do you think we could do this? And he kind of, at that time, said, well, I don't think the headsets could support it, but it's an interesting idea. Let's talk again in another 6 months to a year. So we kind of waited, and then at that time, he introduced me to Paulo, who is the other co-founder, the other half here of Virtual Planet. And he's our kind of tech guru, and he knows a lot about VR development and some of the work. And it was right around the time when the Oculus Go headset was being launched. And that was kind of a game changer, because you didn't all of a sudden require a very expensive laptop to run the VR applications on. That's kind of a standalone, right? So we got a couple of those. Paulo is in São Paulo in Brazil, so he flew over to California. We spent 2 weeks here locked up in my garage, really, and then we came up with a prototype. And at that time, I was working with the city of Santa Cruz on incorporating socioeconomics to their climate adaptation plan, which is kind of a separate thing. But then I approached the team, and one of our long-term partners, her name is Tiffany Wise West. She's kind of our climate adaptation and action director here for the city. We showed this to her and her team, and she's like, "Oh, this is great. We really want to use it." And then we said, well, what kind of features do you want to do? So we kind of co-designed the application with them. They gave us some ideas. We will try things out, bring it back to them. And that was kind of the beginning. And many of the new things that are being incorporated into the tools since then, which was like, multi-language was important. It wasn't there at first. So we said, no, it's very important to reach out to non-English speakers if we really want to be inclusive with the solutions that we're building. Subtitles for accessibility. We have the ability to do like survey, right? So as you go through the Santa Cruz experience, at the end, there are some points where we ask you, do you think this is a good idea or not? And the city gets that information and uses that in their planning. And then the pandemic kind of came up and we thought, well, we can't have events anymore. So we decided to do, a 360 video of the experience would be a really cool thing for folks to try out. So why don't we do that? And then the mobile and the web-based. So that's when we kind of branched out to other platforms as well. But it's an ever-evolving process. Every new iteration, we added a few new features too. So.
Man, so much good stuff here because on the one hand, your ability to adapt to the pandemic and make the application more widespread by putting out a 360 browser version and put it out on mobile, more platforms, your ability to work with cities, with the city government and get them data through surveys, is actually really, really cool. Like that's awesome. I'm really glad because then the city gets to see how important this issue becomes to their constituents and how much. I mean, that's
right.
And it makes so much sense. Like, why wouldn't you want to gather this immediate data from the people experiencing this? And I'm curious, though, in an ideal world, ideal scenario, let's say you have an unlimited budget, with an immense team, what sorts of features or ideas would you implement on the app going forward in this ideal scenario?
Yeah, that's a question we ask ourselves a lot, Chris, because on the one hand, it would be we're looking at how can we make this more scalable, right? We don't want it to, the costs are dropping, every day almost. But, we want this to be accessible to any coastal city. And to do that, we're kind of streamlining our, the production process and how we develop these things. So we can bring, the mission really is to democratize these tools. We started this about 2 years ago. And so far, we're the only ones doing it. So we really need others to kind of pick on it as well. And so we can start spreading this out to more and more communities. But there is a component of this as well that is every community is a little bit different. So we still need to keep that local look and feel so people can relate to the application, right? So when we go into Santa Cruz, the virtual environment that you're in is like a beach shack, kind of a funky looking place, which kind of speaks to the personality of the city, the town. And if you go to Long Beach, it's like it's a different kind of environment. Or Turner Station, for instance, where the senior center was featured in the application. It's in a park. But then we talked to the community. It's like, they said it would be great to see our lunchroom as the virtual environment. So we have to. So it's kind of a little bit of a struggle. But I think at the moment, our next step is really to get more. Or to hire someone to really reach out to more cities, present the products to them, and get more projects going on this kind of we're calling it a starter pack, where you have maybe just a first 360 view of the neighborhood with some impacts and a couple of solutions just to get the conversation going, right? We can't really wait to talk about these issues. We need to speed up how fast we're doing it. And we're seeing how much tools like this can help. But I don't think that, I think if we would get unlimited funds, we would just, buy a bunch more of headsets and give it away to people so they could kind of you start using it more, because one of the limitations of this, as you know, is like not everyone still has a VR headset. So how do we get that reach out? So we're being really strategic on, let's use it at events. Let's get the right people that need to be talking about this at each community to experience it in the headsets. But let's also have it available in other mediums so people can see it as well.
I was saving this question for later, but I just gotta bring it up now. Because you just brought up a really great point, and that is the targeting. Like who should experience? Honestly, everyone should experience it, but just with the limited amount of time we have. I was listening to Sir David King. He's a professor with more than 500 papers published out of Cambridge last night on a podcast. And he was talking about how the next 5 years need to be dramatic in terms of the things we do on a global scale to avert a calamity, and it will define the next century. And I was thinking to and again, because we're sort of in this weird race against time on a slow moving cruise ship wreck, I wonder about, again, the targeting. Yes, everyone should experience your the sea level rise application, but what about how do you reach the top 1% of people whom exercise an immense amount of power and wealth and influence? I can't remember where this came from, but I'm sure I can pull up and put it in the show notes. But I saw somewhere that the biggest 100 companies on the planet are putting out something like 70 to 80% of all the CO2 in the atmosphere. So if you can reach out to their CEOs, to their families, to those shareholders of those companies, maybe that's like 2,000, maybe 3,000 people, and you put headsets on these people and give them this experience, give them something as close as possible to the overview effect, I would imagine that you could have a very a widespread impact compared to me. I mean, I'm just a dude, and I want to help, and I'll add my little grain of sand, but those guys will add, truckloads of sand to to contributing. And I again, have you thought or brainstormed more? What are your thoughts about, how to reach that target audience?
Yeah, that's excellent question too, Chris. I think I wish I had a good answer, but what we've been doing so far is focusing on community level engagement with the folks that can make the decisions at the community level. So I don't like this word, is overused, but the idea is like the stakeholders, right? The folks that have an interest in that maybe piece of the coastline. So like homeowners, business owners, city council, some elected folks. So within that local context, I think we are reaching kind of the right people to have that impact at the local level. But as you alluded to, these things take a long time, right? So if you want to change, some building code to avoid new constructions on areas that are, that have higher risk of coastal storm flooding or sea level rise and other things, that's a process that takes a while. And that's when tapping into those more people with higher influence, it would get, a better benefit. One of the things I'm thinking, that there was something on the news a while back on how much, billionaires care about climate change and some of the efforts that they were doing. I think, some foundations now are starting to invest on it. So I think that, as I mentioned earlier, like all hands on deck, right? You need to have that massive change at the global level, but also at the community side. And at the moment, we're more positioned to look at the community side. I'm always trying to be, because as you also mentioned, this is a daunting kind of, it could be almost paralyzing, right? When you look at the size of the problem. So a couple of things that I do to kind of keep sane and keep the wind on my sails, I like how you said that, is really to focus on what's my sphere of influence, right? Where can I, make the most change and impact, and then try to expand it a little bit more, The other thing I do, of course, is that I love technology. So I decided, well, climate change is such a tough topic that I really want to still do the things I'm passionate about while working to help solve that problem. But kind of being also mindful that I have a limited, energy and time and the impact that we can do. But, when I hear from folks like you, Chris, it gives me, it just warms my heart just to see that the impact seems to be a little even a wider spread than I anticipated. One of the projects we're working on that I'd like to mention very briefly is a wildfire experience. It's like a 360 film that we work with the town of Paradise in California and a couple of a nonprofit here too, the Nature Conservancy. And part of the goal of that experience is to bring it to Sacramento, our capital here, and show that to some of the senators here and the legislators to say, hey, we really need to start addressing this as a prevention issue rather than a recovery, because with millions of dollars, we can save a lot of land, people, resources, and avoid billions of dollars in consequences after the fires happen. So that's another way that we're trying to, maybe bring it to some attention to the issue. Because when we started working on that project, if you haven't seen what one of these wildfires look like, it's like you can't really imagine. So we kind of put you in that first person perspective. We don't let, the fire doesn't get super close to you because we don't want to, again, traumatize people. But it's a way to convey, how violent some of those events are and how urgent the need for action is.
Yeah, I think you're 100% right in doing what you're doing by bringing these very visceral, very real experiences to powerful people at the Capitol in Sacramento, and I think it applies very much to that 1% target audience, wherein the costs of doing nothing or doing very little about the climate crisis will outweigh the benefits of being preventative. Like, I think, again, I need to pull up where I got this number, but somewhere around the cost of doing nothing or going the same path will cost the economy like $100 trillion. And if we really try and we'll try to work things out, we could really put a dent and change and pivot in the right direction with I don't know, some other number, like maybe 100 billion. Again, I got to look up those numbers, but the number would be a lot less, definitely a lot less to be preventative. And rich people would be like, yeah, I'll be able to afford a lot more yachts later on, and my children's children will have a lot more yachts later on if there's a planet around. I'm sorry. One number that comes to mind is from FEMA, where I think based on, I forget how many projects that they did, but it was like a couple dozen or more. They saw that $1 in preparation saved them about $6 when compared with places where adaptation wasn't implemented. So it's very, that link is very clear. Yeah, there's weird. I gotta say, there's patterns in life or the universe or the simulation we're in that are super strange. I gotta say, like, and before I jump into that, because that's a little bit more down the rabbit hole, I want to share that I was working a little while ago on my own VR. You heard of Microsoft Flight Simulator, where it's just this giant open world, literal world of like places you can visit, fly through and stuff like that. And I started working with myself on a fire. I saw a video once on YouTube not too long ago, because last year we had some wildfires in California that were crazy. And I'm anticipating that this year is not going to be fun either. But I got inspired to want to do something, and I started working on this app using Unity, where basically it's a flight simulator, but instead of just flying around, you're fighting fires. It's a little more interactive.
Nice.
And it definitely targets more of that audience of like people who want to have that extra level interactivity and just being able to feel good about, because again, that Stanford study of like getting people to pick up trash more maybe all of a sudden, if you're fighting fires through this VR simulator, maybe you'll care about the forest more, and maybe you'll become a stakeholder out of, just because you had that experience virtually. I got to give it to those people out there fighting fires. It's an
Oh
insane
yeah.
job. It really is, and I'm glad you're thinking about these things as well. Um,
Yeah, it's insane. And this year, first, I'm afraid to say it's setting up to be worse than previous years because it's been, I think, the driest April, I think, in California's history or recent history as well. So fingers crossed here for, some humid days.
Indeed, and there's no one. This perfect segue to my next question, because there's not one single silver bullet that's gonna save us all from this, cascade of different things that are coming from all different directions. For example, with your Elkhorn slough experience that's out in Monterey, I believe.
That's right.
You guys were highlighting that by using restoration methods, native plants, and all that good stuff, you could perhaps minimize the impact of sea level rise. And perhaps you can talk to me more about the dynamics of how that works and the different solutions that could happen um, in order to prevent some of the worst in different across different communities.
Yeah, that's yeah, great you brought that up because there are things we can do today, there are things we can do in the next 10, 20, 30 years, and then there are things that we'll have to do later down the road, right? So typical adaptation options that we see here in California, and we've been doing this, I think, over the whole country, even like in Texas, in Florida, it's just this idea of beach nourishment or sand replenishment, where it's like you just add more sand to the beach as it gets eroded and washed out. My advisor, shout out to Dr. Gary Griggs. He has a great op-ed at the LA Times just last week talking about this. I can send you the link to that too, Chris. But the idea is that he's saying on that piece is that you can't win against the Pacific Ocean, right? We can try, we can buy some time, but eventually, the only viable long-term option is to maybe start moving back from the coast.
It's a lot of water.
It's a lot of water. And we don't need to do that today, right? When we talk about this idea, it's a concept, it's very controversial. It's talked about as managed retreat. But it's this idea of, when we use retreat, it means like we're being defeated. And that's not, it's like smart planning, right? It's not really being defeated. But when we start talking about that, it becomes it's like, we're not talking about doing that next year, next 5 years, maybe not even in the next 10 years. But eventually, when we get there, how do we talk about it? And what are the more just and, ways to transition to that? And, so people retain their wealth and, their livelihoods and all of that. So that's kind of a tricky thing. But typically short to midterm, there's these options of adding more sand. You can also create vegetated sand dunes. But, I participated in a couple of studies looking at the cost-benefit analysis of different adaptation options. And, the other option that you have is create armoring or building a wall to protect a property. But that's, has trade-offs with it. So when you build a seawall, if you have the sand on the beach that gets eroded, in the winter, sometimes it comes back on the summer, sometimes not as much, depending on the size of, the storms. But over time, as sea levels rise, the beach can't migrate inland. So when it hits that seawall, it just ends up drowning. And then you don't have a beach anymore, you just have a seawall with the water hitting it. And it costs money to maintain that. And you lose all that recreational value that you had with the sand. People come in, you have tourists, and that's real economic value. And then when we ran the numbers of all these options, in the long run, armoring the beach always comes at like on the lowest cost benefit ratios there, because you lose all the benefit of having nature has value too. And I think part of adapting to climate, has this idea of nature-based adaptation. Like how can we use nature to protect and help us to adapt. There's studies also from Hurricane Sandy, where areas that were protected by mangrove forests saw fewer damages to their properties, and they were able to recover fast. And then mangroves also increase fisheries value. They filter the water that's coming from the land, and they take up extra nutrients, so you avoid having algae blooms, and so there's all this co-benefits that you get when you use nature to help us to adapt. And that was something that we're looking at the Elkhorns too, right? You could just build a giant wall there that would cost a lot of money and will basically kill the marsh. We were talking before the chat here, Chris, about the sea otters, all those different great things that we have. Or you could work with nature and create a gentle slope and give the marsh room to migrate inland, at least for a few more decades. Or you could just raise the highway on piles and allow the ecosystem to kind of thrive underneath it. But on the other hand, you have to look at the costs, right? It costs a lot more. One option could be more expensive than the other. So that's one of the things we try to show on this applications, is kind of this trade-offs between these different choices that we make today. And if you really want to raise a highway for 6 miles, that's a 30, 40-year project, right? So we have to start planning now and planting the seeds to really get it right, I think, or at least the word I'm looking for, maladaptation, right? We don't want to keep making the same mistakes.
It's definitely, just like how you said, there's definitely going to be a combination of different strategies and different tools that will have to be used on a sort of case-by-case basis to figure out ways to adapt, overcome, and do our best. And going back to the application, your application, and sort of from a user experience design perspective, when in the before the pandemic, back in those days, back in the good old days, or the before days, when you observed other people trying the experience, and again, from that user experience design sort of hat on, like, what sort of reactions from the users made you say, oh, okay, I did my job. Oh, okay, I didn't, that's interesting. Oh, okay, I didn't see that coming. Can you highlight some of those stories, those things that might have happened? Yeah.
Yeah, I have, and it's super interesting. I'll start with my own reaction to one of the things we did, which is, I think, that's when I think, all of us in VR have, or a lot of us, I talk to some folks, they have this one moment that they usually remember when they really got the impact of VR. And to me, even though I've been playing games for a while, and it wasn't until I think last year when it hit me that way, which was looking at an image from Turner Station, which is a community in Maryland that we did one of our first apps. So the way that we do this, we look at a 2D model of potential flooding scenarios. We use, the NOAA's sea level rise viewer for that. So we look at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 feet of sea level rise, and what it was for a community park, like what it looks like. And so when I sent that model to our artist, shout out to Gianluca, he's our kind of artist extraordinaire. So he worked on the renderings and he sent it back to me, and I put my headset on and I'm looking at the park. And then I looked to the right, Chris, and I saw the neighborhood. It was all underwater under, most of those scenarios. And I was like, I forgot to tell him that it was not part of the scope, was the first part, but that's great because we got it. But when I looked to the right, I had that feeling. It was really like getting like a punch in the stomach. It was like, oh my God. It's like, we're talking about this park, but if you look at those houses, there's hundreds of houses over there. It's a low income neighborhood. Like, how are we going to adapt to protect, the community here? So that to me was my kind of experience. And thankfully, in part to that image, now there is a conversation about the community's resilience as well, not just the park. So that was kind of I love talking about this because it was super powerful. So you get kind of the same feelings when I kind of talk about it. A couple others that we had, it was like some folks that in Long Beach, we showed some of the communities, some of the scenarios to local home residents, and they were looking at the peninsula area and they're flooding. And then this one person I recall saying, "Well, oh, my house is. Can you show me my house flooding?" And it was kind of an interesting kind of like, why do you want to see that? But it's just, I think, something to that medium again, right? How do we, show or see and experience these things? We did have one person in Maryland that had a stronger reaction. There's you can actually, I think, hear her at a story that came out on NPR about that project. I can also send you the link to that, where it was someone that had experienced flooding in her life before. So she had a very strong reaction. Oh my God, I'm not ready for this. And I just tell her, no, just remove the headset. Let's talk about it. So, and kind of brings me to one thing I'd like to kind of bring up too, Chris, real quick, is that even though we love technology, I think using this technology to address some of these issues, it can't be just about the technology. So we make sure that every project that we work on has an on-the-ground component. So it's very important, I think, to have someone that you can talk to, especially at a community event, because when people see their own city, their places that their house or places that they live in, then there's not only their reactions are stronger because they're seeing that in VR, but they're also stronger because they recognize the place, right? So I think it's important to take care with that. But the other reaction that I had was at a natural history museum here in Santa Cruz. We were showing some of the Santa Cruz scenarios here, and there was this one person he was on the other extreme, right? He lost all hope that we're going to solve this. It's like, well, why do you even bother? It's like, there's nothing we can do. So we kind of talked to, it was a couple, and we talked to them. It's like, no, here's what you can do. And so I think it's important to have that call to action at the end to spark that hope and that interest. It's like, and I always do that by asking people, so what are you passionate about? What are you good at? What do you like working? And then we it's very easy to find ways to apply that to help with the climate crisis, right?
And I feel like this is the perfect place. The sort of I've worked as I worked at building communities across different virtual reality companies, and this just sort of reminds me about one of the many ways to build a community is to build around a common cause. And the common cause here is the survival of the human species. I feel like you guys, and I am sure you've thought about it. I'm sure that I'm sure you probably already did, but I'm curious to know whether, are you providing people with a call to action where like, hey, here's the Facebook group or here's the Discord link to join up with other people who've tried the experience, who are impacted just as you, who want to talk about it, want to share what they want to do together, want to organize, because this is like I guess the closest thing is like soccer, like, oh, okay, we're Real Madrid and those guys are Chelsea and we definitely don't like those guys, so right. Let's band up. Let's band up against this calamity, this crisis, because the future is here. Like we're out of time, and so I wonder again, what are the conversations around building communities or a community that can mobilize just based on these experiences that you're providing people?
So one of the things that we do is we try to find and we work with cities that are also representative of similar cities in different coastal areas. So they can, if they can do an experience for their own, that they at least can see, this town looks a lot like Santa Cruz, so I can use the Santa Cruz to relate to some things. So what we see happening is every new project that we start, they want to talk to the communities where we just did the projects. And we also found that the communities where we do the projects, they're super eager to talk to the next ones as well. So there's this, it's not formal, and I love your idea of this community of Sea Level Rise, Explorer users, and try to organize that in some way. I really appreciate that idea, Chris. We haven't done that in a formal way. It's being more like the project teams consulting with other cities that we worked on, And we just published a paper kind of summarizing 3 of our projects, and also adding a little bit of a lit review from the use of VR and environmental literacy and some other things that I can also definitely send you the link to that. So that paper was written by a team from Turner Station, Santa Cruz, and Long Beach. So it's like we have 8 authors in that study, and it was great. It was a really great collaboration process. It was like, oh, what did you learn? What did we learn? And how can we apply this to the next iteration of the project? But we haven't done anything on that user community, and I think that's a great idea, and I'll definitely look into that.
Yeah, because then I'd be like, yeah, I guess I'm not alone in this, and there's other people.
Absolutely.
I gotta say, I'll be honest here. I have a fault in my character when I deal with people who are climate skeptics. I'll be honest. I gotta be frank with people. I've nothing to hide, but like there'll be instances where I'll meet someone really cool, and I want to be their friend, and I want to hang out with them a lot, and then they introduce me to their friend, and then we'll talk about climate change. My friend is aligned with climate change, but their friend will say something like, "Oh, I don't think humans are causing climate change. I don't think we have the ability to. The world is so big. How could we cause climate change? Look at me. I'm just a person." Or they'll say something like, "Oh, I don't. You don't even." They'll say something like, "Chris, you don't even know what 40 billion tons of fossil fuel looks like emitted into the atmosphere every year. What does that even mean? It's a number that's too big for even you to understand. How can they understand it?" And so I get angry, and I don't never speak to them again. So definitely a fault in my character. But how do you approach climate skeptics? Like, how do you have the patience to reach these kids? I mean, that's a meme, but to reach these people that don't share the idea, that don't share the belief that we have.
Yeah, that's an interesting one.
A belief in facts, by the way. It's not.
Yeah, that's I was at a call, and one of the senior scientists, I think from NASA, said, "Well, it doesn't really it doesn't matter if you believe it or not. It's happening. It's science. It's not going to change the outcome." But I think the issue here is this, right? You have extremes like on everything, and there's maybe 20-30% of the people that are not they don't believe it for whatever reason. They deny, that this is happening. And there's pretty much nothing you or I or anyone could do to change their minds, right? So I think I wouldn't waste energy with them, because unfortunately, I think there's that middle of the road people that are like, well, I like you mentioned your friend's colleague that said, well, the planet's so big that how can we be doing this? And that was kind of part of my journey, right? It's like, well, the planet is so big, how can one species be altering? And let me study this. And then, 10 years later, I'm here talking about it. But not everyone has the luxury and time and interest to, quit their jobs and go study this issue. So I think it's important. I try to tease out and figure out, well, is this person interested in learning more? Or is this person like looking for, a confrontation, or is just trying to, what is that? Is there room here for some conversation that could be, constructive in a way to kind of make their minds in a way? But it's tricky. We just applied for some like a grant to do a kind of a different study. Because even if they don't believe it, we still need them on board with some of the solutions, right? And I like to get them on board with us. But there's this idea of framing, right? So instead of talking about this, like you go to a community that people are more resistant to the idea of climate change and sea level rise, and you talk. So if we don't, what if we didn't talk to them about climate change and sea level rise, but we talk to them, it's like, hey, remember Sandy? Remember Katrina? Things could happen again, and here's like 5 things that we can do to adapt. Or maybe, a question I'm interested in is there ways of presenting the information to them that could maybe shift their belief systems or break into some of that resistance. There's some great research coming out from Florida. A couple of researchers, I think from Georgia, did the study there, where they actually found that animated images with some text kind of strategically placed around the images could help break some of those barriers and convince people that, you know, some of those things are real. So I think that's super exciting. Another thing where I think VR can have an active role, but I think it's going to be a combination of VR, you know, or immersive tools or animated features with, you know, this framing conversation. And yeah, there's one more thing that I think. I'll get back to that. I think there's one thing I'm forgetting here, but it is hard. It's not an easy task.
No, it's.
Oh yeah, I remember. The thing is that, you know, there's a strong correlation, of course, between, you know, political affiliation and things like that with the, you know, how much you believe it or not in some of those things, and I think this idea of, you know, I belong to a tribe and, you know, I listen to my leaders and I identify with them. So I think there's the other angle of this where, you know, maybe finding someone in these communities that become the spokesperson or someone that can deliver that message rather than, you know, this guy from Brazil that has a VR company coming in to talk to me about sea level rise. What we do is like we find that trusted community leader, we bring that person in, someone that's, you know, on board with the issue, and then we get them to bring their friends, right? So like your friend's colleague, maybe your friend would have a, you know, a way to reach to his friend that would be more efficient than if you or I tried to do it, right?
It's, you know, and it, you know, it's such a weird time we live in where in science itself is politicized. Like I'm not an expert. I will tell you right now. I know what that 417 parts per million when referring to CO2 means that for every million particles of things in the air, 417 of those are CO2. Like that, I understand that. I understand that the whiteness of the glaciers reflects sunlight. I understand that CO2 gets trapped in the atmosphere. It just doesn't leave the Earth. Like I understand these things because there are people who spend decades, years of their lives invested in working on and learning and consistently updating their theories, their hypotheses, you know, using scientific method. It's like if I have a growth in my arm and I don't know what it is, I'm not going to go to a car mechanic. You know, I'm going to go to a doctor, and the doctor isn't, you know, because the doctor is the guy who knows it. It's like climate scientists are the doctors of the earth. And if 97% of climate scientists, hey, we have cancer, then I'm going to listen to the doctors. I'm not going to listen to, again, the people. You know, I love my dad. He's an awesome man. But the other day he told me, he's like, hey, man, you know, Fox News is predicting that in 100 years, we're going to have cities in Antarctica. And he was happy about it. He's like, yeah, he was hopeful in a hopeful manner. Oh, and I'm like, but I was like, Dad, you understand what that means? We don't want cities in Antarctica. Like that means what makes you think like human life, civilization as we know it will thrive when we have the ability to put cities in Antarctica? Like he's like, hundreds of millions of people are going to live in Antarctica. I'm like, oh no, that's Fox News propaganda. And
who's going to pay for that?
And so it's weird. You know, it's a weird thing. And I completely understand where the struggle comes from, because this segues into my next question in terms of like, how do you communicate science better? You know, what is it gonna take? And I love the idea of using virtual reality the way you're using it. And I even thought about, one of the things that I thought about a lot was like, okay, how do I visualize? How do I visualize 40 billion particles of CO2? And how do I, in virtual reality, how do I make it like a story that that has this narrative that people can sort of attach their heartstrings to? And it's hard. It's definitely hard. Yeah.
It is super hard. And that's one of the things that we realized earlier, I think it was later last year, is that, well, we're turning from a VR development application kind of company to a storytelling company. So we're just now reaching out. We have a colleague that collaborates with us. She's a psychologist. We have journalists that's helping us to better even write the script. How do you start? How do you kind of storyboard some of these experiences in a way that they have the best effect on people? And then we also talk to community or city staff and folks that are actually working on the next general plan for the city that they need to submit later this year. And say, hey, have you thought of these things, and how can we include this? So it's communicating it. We have this kind of it's really basic, like what is your audience, what are the key messages, and what are the takeaways that you want them to get out of this. But how do you identify that and write it? It's a tricky part. A lot of our experiences, the longest task is writing the script. Will be the 3D models will be ready, the flooding scenarios, everything, and then we're sometimes 2, 3, 4 months waiting until all the wording in the script is right, so we or close to right, because people they need to agree on things, and sometimes how do you convey some of those things? But one of the things that on how to communicate it, I think we need to simplify it without dumbing it down too much. Mm-hmm. So one of the things we get in every project, like, well, what scenarios are you using to show the sea level rise, and then what are the assumptions, and did you account? So we don't get into that in this like 5 to 8 minutes that you're looking at this in VR. That's not the goal, right? So we kind of steer away from that minute details and say, hey, this is from the United States Geological Survey, is the best model available, and here's a low, medium, high scenarios that we need to look into. We don't know which one is going to be right or when they're going to be right, but we know they're coming, and it's going to be between A and B. So the point is not to get that scenario right in this context, is really to show people that envelope of potential futures, so we can start talking about, okay, when are we going to start doing these things? What kind of adaptation pathways can we plan now, so we can fund them, make the decisions at the right time, put triggers, and start measuring things. So when sea levels reach Main Street here, what is it then that we're going to take action? Or maybe it's when it's 10 feet away on a high tide. How do you include that, but also keep the experience simple enough that folks can say, oh, here's, sea levels are rising. It's going to flood this entire neighborhood eventually later in the century. I can do this 3 things maybe in the short term, and then I need to have this really hard conversation about moving away from the coast eventually. And that, I think that's kind of how we've been doing with these tools. And I think it's been successful to start the conversations and at least get people a little more engaged, right?
I agree. And I'm curious to know, help me weigh in the sort of the pros and cons of the wording of, because it wasn't until the last 2 or 3, 4, maybe 4 years that I'm starting to see that the media is addressing climate change, some parts of the media, as a climate crisis. And even then, a part of me thinks, but even is that enough? Why not call it the climate calamity, or why not call it mass suicide by human-made climate alteration? At what point? Maybe that's a little extreme, but what? Yeah, again, we can be. Help me weigh in the pros and cons of being too extreme. Maybe are we? Yeah. If we scare people too much, maybe that puts them off and then they give up. Well,
I think that there's definitely that risk. And we tried, there's, studies show that you can't scare people into action too much, especially with climate change, because again, it's such a massive problem that's very easy to become paralyzed. Yeah. Say, hey, I can't do anything. It's like, I might as well, or whatever I do is not really going to make a difference. So why bother? So I think that's when, I think it's a fine line between showing some of this impacts in a way that, like, oh my God, this is serious. But then you have to have that, okay, what can you do about it? How do you inspire someone that's seeing that to say, oh, I'm going to pay attention. Maybe I'll come up to the next, city hall meeting where they're going to talk about this plan, and I'm going to say, hey, I don't like this idea, or I like that idea. or maybe I'm going to talk to my friend that doesn't think this is real and try to, bring that person on board. So I think that's a part of the answer here, right? You need to, but it is a problem. There many people argue that unless we have rapid systemic change, things can't be avoided. But that means I worked on a study about the impacts of plastic pollution to vulnerable populations, and things like single-use plastic, right? How do you get people to stop using it? You got to either give them an alternative or completely outright ban it and make it illegal to do it. But there are consequences to that. So I think it's like a multi-tiered from the local to federal, and international agreements that will be needed. But if past is an indication, is like we're not moving nearly fast enough. Mm-hmm. But I think that focusing on going back to kind of what's our kind of sphere of influence here is like, well, we can help these communities to talk about, like, if we can avoid the worst impacts or some of the impacts, what can we do starting now to mitigate the risks and some of the impacts that are coming?
Yeah, 100%. The single-use plastic thing is a big deal.
Another, right?
Yeah, because and that one I have a lot of hope, because I got to make sure that I double check the study, but somewhere showed that there's that single-use plastics are causing are allegedly causing infertility in men and reducing the size of men's penises across the world. And knowing men and humanity the way I do, I have a feeling that we will spring to action immediately. Well, because of that, and I think but that's another one. And I have a question about the climate crisis in the COVID pandemic, honestly, because I think there's a pattern here that I see in that both are similar in that they're problems of exponential nature, of an exponential nature. One is a disease that works on the timescales that we can understand, right? That we humans understand, days, weeks, months, right? And the other one is a disease that we can't really wrap our minds around because it's on Earth, more like a Earth planet-wide timescale, like decades, centuries. I would say even years at this point. But my question is, because of that abstractness of understanding exponential growth, the exponential growth of a COVID outbreak, the exponential growth of allowing glaciers to melt, of allowing sea levels to rise, of allowing more and more pollution to get released, causes this cascade effect that is sometimes really hard to track. And I'm curious to know, what are your thoughts on, what the COVID pandemic taught us, looking at this issue that is, again, human scale, and how humanity responded to something that is, again, on a human scale. It's kind of like comparing a car crash versus, again, the slow moving train wreck. Like, they're both going in the same direction. And I'm curious, what are your thoughts in terms of, like, based on how humans reacted to COVID, how do you think we're going to be able to react to climate change?
Yeah, I think we really need to up our game, don't we?
Yeah.
I think the even now, when we know how to produce the vaccines, we can get them out there, and you see now people don't want to take it, or places that really need it don't have access to it. So I think that's not I think we could have handled this way much better. But I think with the climate, I think there is a lot of work that has been done already. There's California is a great example, right, where we have very aggressive targets to reduce our emissions. I think the federal government is coming up with, even more aggressive targets for the whole country coming up. We have emissions controls here in the state. We have, a cap and trade scheme of emissions here in California. So we have a lot of policies that are being implemented that are great examples and could be applied in other places. And I think this is kind of gaining momentum as well. So I think we are kind of moving in the right direction. I think the problem is that we're not moving fast enough. So I think we need a little bit more like energy into that and get some of these policies enacted elsewhere in other places a little faster. But, we're like the pandemic. If you look at what things look like, 6 months ago and now what they look like here in the US, I think it was a rapid, it's like night and day, right? It's like I just went out and got a haircut yesterday after being, fully vaccinated. I didn't even worry about it. I was still wearing the mask, but it's like, oh, this kind of things are coming back to normal. So I have hope that we'll get to, things won't be as bad as they could be. Just how much we can reduce some of this climate impacts is still a question. But I think we're making efforts to get there. It's not fast enough. We're still going to have to deal with a lot of the impacts. And that's where I believe I can add, more value is like that adaptation and communication side. But there's a lot of really smart people working on reducing emissions and trying to get some international agreements and things done at all levels too. So I think we'll have to. It's really hard to predict the future, right? So
Absolutely.
But I think there's some
hope, and I sorry for interrupting, but I'm just bringing things down to a close. Just a couple more questions. Do you think that we'll have to? I'm already hearing, watching, and hearing and reading about the argument for geoengineering the planet, putting silver sulfide in the atmosphere, finding ways to refreeze the Arctic to make sure the permafrost in Siberia doesn't get released. I mean, that's planet scale engineering, and I'm curious, is that inevitable? And obviously it's not going to cure the disease. It won't solve the problem, but it'll definitely buy us more time, or maybe it'll make things worse. What are your thoughts? What are your thoughts on geoengineering the planet?
I have one thought is like, what could go wrong, right? I think that's kind of my general kind of reaction to this. And I teach a course on sustainable coastal management. We have a class dedicated to geoengineering ideas. And I think that the thing is that the system is so complex that no one can really predict, what the impacts of changing one variable would have on the whole system. It's really, really hard with all the feedbacks. And again, it's a whole planet, right? Having said that, I have some friends that are really strong believers of one option, which is to fertilize the oceans to create, more productivity. You create a little more algae and you can kickstart some ecosystems on the oceans that way. And a little bit of that carbon from the algae kind of sinks to the bottom. And it's a way to kind of reduce some of the concentrations of CO2. So that I think it's kind of on the last extreme side of things. But even then, if you start, massive scales of that could have other impacts that we may not know. Is it inevitable? I think it is, because the cost of doing, if you want to shoot some particles into the atmosphere for reflect sunlight, that just saying it sounds kind of crazy to me.
Yeah.
But that's on the, someone did a study of how much that would cost. And it was, around, if I'm not mistaken, it's about $50 billion per year to do that. So if there's a country that feels like, hey, we're getting the worst here, we're going to become an inhabitable desert if this thing continues, let's just start doing that. So I think and there's no global organism or organization that really oversees any of that at the moment as well. So there's talks about creating something like what's the governance around some of these projects that are going to very likely to come up in the next decade or two. So
yeah, that's a whole can of worms, and because we could go on this podcast for hours and hours and hours, I want to wrap things up with the last question, and that is, this topic can be overwhelming, and it can get scary quickly, really quickly. So I want to leave the listeners with some moment of inspiration and hope, and obviously we've talked about the reality of of what could come, what could happen. But again, I don't want to paralyze people, and because I'm one of those people. If I get too scared, I freeze. I'm
Right.
one of those people.
Yeah. Yeah.
I hella freeze. So what are you hopeful for? What are some positive things happening in this space of solving and alleviating and contributing to helping out against this climate crisis? Whether it's technology, whether it's awareness, whether less political friction. What are you seeing that gives you hope?
There's several things. I think that the fact that I see people from all different sorts of life now interested in this issue, just having this conversation with you, Chris, gives me so much hope. Just to hear about your concern and your enthusiasm about the problem. So that gives me a lot of hope. I think there, younger generations. I was talking to my niece the other day, and she's like, "Oh, no, why would I ever have a car? There's so much." So things are starting to change in that sense, where mobility and the way that cities are rethinking themselves and starting to plan for things like micromobility, right? You rent a bike, you get to the bus or to your train, and then you go to work. Why do you need to drive a car where you could have like this really nice corridor in the town that has trees and there's a cafe and you can stop by? So there are all these things that are, I think we're starting to reimagine what cities look like. And I think the pandemic really helped with that, where all of a sudden you have all these really large open roads that are empty. So how can we better use some of that space? So I think that gives me hope. I think sometimes when I see the impacts of the Long Beach experience that we did in VR, we haven't advertised it yet, and we're just going to start a campaign to launch it. But it got over 1,000 downloads all over the planet, and like no one is just from people finding it and looking. So I think there's more interest. And there's also more creative policies that are being enacted. And I go back to California as being a great example of some. We get a lot of things wrong here, but I think on the climate front, we're doing a lot of things right that become examples and that other states and countries can use to show. And we prove that you can have economic growth decoupled from increasing your emissions. So let's find those examples and replicate them and escalate them in other places as well. And I love this idea of working with multiple communities because they learn from each other. So how can we get the stuff that's working in one place? Things like, how can we use nature in our benefit to really help us to reduce some of those future risks in a way that adds value, right? Or have more fish now because there's mangrove here and the water is clean. So, hey, it worked for them. Why can't we do it over here? So I think there's a lot to be hopeful here. And like I have so much fun doing the work that I do, despite this being, a paralyzing issue at times. And I do have my bad days. But I think we're also learning about things like surge capacity. How much can you really take on? And being more aware of our own kind of sphere of influence and our limitations as well, right? There are whole weeks that I go off without opening the news at all. I start to feel a little alienated. I was like, no, I need this. I need to recharge. So I think we're learning more about how we function and what we need to be more effective as well. So that also gives me quite a bit of hope.
I'm so grateful for your time. I honestly feel like this is one of those conversations that just energized me in a way that I wasn't expecting, and so if there's anything I can help with, I will definitely try to do my part. Dr. Calil, I'm so honored and thankful. And how can people stay in touch? How can people follow what you're doing? And get connected and all that good stuff?
Yeah, we have for the company stuff, we have our website is virtualplanet.tech. It has our email there. You can feel free to reach out. We love hearing from people about that. And I think that's probably the easiest way. But I'm happy to provide my email to folks if they want to get in touch. Just my name, juliano.calil@gmail.com.
Sweet. I'll put that in the show notes. I'll put your links to social media. Make sure everybody listening, go download the app, go check it out, put it on as many faces as possible, and make sure you have your shoulder around so that they can, put their head on after, because
Awesome.
it's both it's amazing,
Yeah.
and I'm so glad I got to talk to you, and I'm so grateful for your work. Dr. Calil, you have been a true scholar and gentleman of virtual reality. Thanks for your time, and thank you everyone for listening, and I'll see y'all later in the metaverse.
Thank you so much.